Pamela Glavin, who designed this gorgeous broadside of Megan's winning poem, which you should absolutely pick up at the end of the night. And then thank you to Franny Choi, my co-editor, who I believe is on their way, for their wonderful editorial support and poetic acumen. Now, while our reading takes place here at Amherst Books, the Massachusetts Review operates out of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which acknowledges that it was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation and on the land of the Norwottuck community. We begin with gratitude for nearby waters and lands. We recognize these lands and waters as important relations with which we are all interconnected and depend upon to sustain life and well-being. The Pocumtuck had connections with these lands for millennia. Over 400 years of colonization, when Pocumtuck peoples were displaced, many joined their Algonquin relatives to the east, south, west, and north. That includes Mashpee, Anaquina, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Mohegan, Pequot, Mohican communities, and Abenaki and other nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. These native peoples still maintain connections and relationships of a land grant and care for these lands today. We also acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Amherst is a land grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Grant Act, portions of the land from the 82 native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build the university. As an active step towards decolonizations, we encourage you to learn more about the native nations whose homelands UMass Amherst now resides on, and the indigenous homelands on which you live and work. We also invite you to deepen your relationship to these living lands and waters. So, for a little history about the prize itself, for 25 years, Anne Halley was the poetry editor of MR. Had a long association with the English department, and was the author of 3 distinct volumes of verse and many prize-winning stories, while enjoying a long career as a beloved teacher in the US and abroad. The Anne Halley Prize is co-sponsored by the Massachusetts Review and the English department of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. A prize of $500 is awarded annually for the best poem to appear in the preceding year of MR, as chosen by 2 editors and a member of the English department. The prize poet is invited to give a spring reading then in Amherst, and this is actually the first reading since I took over as poetry editor for the Massachusetts Review that we've had this event in person, so this is a particularly special event, certainly for myself. And this year's recipient and the poet we've all gathered to hear this evening is Megan Pinto. Yeah. Megan Pinto's debut collection of poetry is forthcoming with 4-Way Books in fall of 2024, so be on the lookout for that, aside from getting the broadside this evening. Her poems can be found or are forthcoming in Guernica, Ploughshares, Lit Hub, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. Megan has received scholarships and fellowships from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing, the Port Townsend Writers Conference, Story Knife, and an Amy Award from Poets and Writers. She is currently a 2022-2023 artist fellow at the Peace Studio, and Megan lives in Brooklyn and holds an MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson MFA program, the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers. My workshop students are often convinced that every poem, save for the poems that they write themselves, of course, have arrived fully formed, like for the author, without seeming error or need of attention or scrutiny, without structural confusion or flat language or any problems in narrative logic. They're convinced that these poems arrive without cliche. If you are present in this room, you likely understand that nothing could be further from the truth. Poems, good poems, memorable poems, or transcendent poems require work. They require attention and re-seeing. They require an understanding and growing mastery of craft. Now, having said that, Megan Pinto does make poems look easy. In the quote, "In the winter of my life," unquote, she writes, to begin her poem, "A poem is a landscape of the mind," a title so direct in its expression, one wonders if it isn't perhaps some kind of trick. She continues, "Afternoons I watched light fade from the faces of brownstones. I took long, aimless walks by the water. Each day, more leaves fell." Her sentences are clean and clear. The mind of her speakers typically precise and careful. Yet moving associatively, the aforementioned stanza closes on, quote, "the starkness of trees nearing winter, their sheer nakedness." An odd evocative fragment. Come and join me. Hi. Hi. And, hi, sweetie. Yeah. An odd evocative fragment which raises questions in the reader and signals a shift. Oh, hi. I'm obviously going to be a very active reader and participant, but it raises questions and it also signals a shift, albeit subtly. It is often in these quiet craft choices that Megan is at the height of her power. A shift in sentence structure, or say, after detailing the slow and terrible erosion of her father's health in Wild Swans, which we were also lucky enough to publish at the Massachusetts Review, as well as the myths and beliefs that one must disregard or turn away from, as those things also erode. Pinto's speaker seemingly turns away from the father, her attention instead on the immediate past and on the swans of Prospect Park and the, quote, "places where the swans could not swim," though possibly on the precipice of revelation, as they carefully tread the fragile ice. Pinto doesn't offer us resolution because her speaker isn't afforded resolution. Her speaker doesn't, quote, "take flight against those unbearably blue skies," end quote, which would certainly be easier than managing sadness or grief. There's no high or lofty ideas. Her attention is on the swans, which are on the water, testing the ice, which can be cold and hard as the fact of illness or loss, which they may or may not make it across. During the residency period one spends as a Cave Canem Fellow, you are admonished to do one thing the entire time you're there: write the hard poem. Megan Pinto writes the hard poem. Hard in what it risks, hard in what it demands, of her as well as us. If what's being argued about our current cultural and historical moment is to be believed, tackling hard things is supposed to make us better, more whole as humans. That's how I feel anytime I've encountered Megan Pinto's work. Better, more whole. And I think you will too. So please help me welcome this year's Halley Prize winner, Megan Pinto.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I am going to pour myself some water because I know I'm going to want that at some point. Future Megan is going to thank me. So what I thought I would do is I want to read the poem that's being honored here tonight, and then I thought I would just go through the manuscript. So my book coming out from Four-Way is called Saints of Little Faith, and yeah, I thought we might just take a journey and that I'd read poems that I don't normally read, because that's kind of the gift of this space and time. So this poem is being honored by the Massachusetts Review, and it's called Chiaroscuro after Caravaggio's Paul. I try and go back to the bottom of the placid blue lake or maybe the storm's calm eye. This is how I bargain for your love in my mind, like a child. On this sidewalk in Miami, like a sidewalk in New York, I could be anyone. I walk toward the boardwalk and the coming of night. Am I the void, or the spirit that fills it? When Paul fell, a horse was poised, about to trample his head. My teacher said those who convert before death receive less prominence in the kingdom of heaven, but we don't get much time. Could God be this moment between the lurch and the stammer of my mind? If I were a painting, the light would be sensuous. It would tell you something about the way your hands still linger over my body. Look how I close my eyes. Somewhere the lake shore meets the overcast dark. Gulls teeter across the ice. Sometimes they slip, their boat bodies rocking. Sun melts a cool blue pool at the center where two swans dive. Sometimes I am hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, all at once. I Google the gulls, not seagulls, but maybe a black-tailed gull. Why must we persist within such cold? A woman in a down coat examines berries at the market off-season. They are hard like stones. I want to pluck stray feathers from the seams of her sleeve, return them to her hands. Genesis. God made the world with his mouth. He spoke, and the heavens appeared. Imagine a room with no windows or doors. Once, trapped on an elevator in Paris, far away from everyone who knew my name, I was free to be anyone. I spoke, and nothing appeared. Even before sun, there was light. God smiled, and his teeth gave off an ethereal glow. There are places I can't go, like the deep sea, where I could not watch a Bathynomius gigantus emit its light. There are things I cannot say, like how the dinoflagellate who fornicate relate to the dinoflagellate who keep dividing themselves into two. All power is a kind of force. My father tells me when he was a child he was bad. Nuns beat his wrists and slapped his hands with sticks. Sometimes his pinky will not fully flex. When I call my father these days, I do not know what to say, but I stay on the phone and we breathe. He tells me, you know, I hate hanging up the phone. Whenever I do, I'm alone. In heaven there will be no bodies, which exist to tempt us or move us toward grace. I try and imagine a bodiless place, full of holographic angels or saints, walking through clouds or staring into space. When I think of grace, I see my grandmother on the carpet, folded over at her knees. I see my mother in lamplight, eyes closed and feeling for the next rosary bead. As a child, my mother waited at outside St. Michael's in Mayheem for rations of milk and curds of cheese. She tells me they had only white bread to eat, which is how I imagine manna, torn and falling from God's open palms like bags of Sara Lee before geese at the park. Inside all my Bible picture books, God's face was European, maybe even Portuguese, but what's in a name? At the discount bread store, all the bread looked the same. Some Saturdays I wandered the aisles while my father washed our blankets at the laundromat. I hated Raleigh, where my body stayed bruised from games at school. Only the body holds what the mind cannot. At my grandmother's funeral, bruises blued her arms, and we learned these were marks from where she was bound by the nuns for speaking too loudly at meals. I batter my body to make it enslaved, wrote St. Paul to the Corinthians. In high school, I studied feminism by night, religion by day. When mornings came, I spent an hour straightening my hair and lining my eyes. I read somewhere that one should imagine a God that they could trust. The author chose a female God, the kind of God who radiated light that did not blind. So I closed my eyes. Then I tried so hard to imagine her. Straightening my hair did not work out for me. Well, I have very curly hair, but I've learned to embrace that. Anonymous city. Little fire, small flame. He tugs at the belt loop of my jeans. We let our bodies sway. I live in a dining room on Lorimer Street, a naked bulb dangling over me, my futon, my mismatched sheets. I am love's reckless student. I take copious notes. Listening to my roommate and her boyfriend fuck, I would open my window if I had one. But in a hotel bar beneath my hotel room, I could be anyone. I say things to my bartender like, "You missed me," and we laugh and take shots, and he grazes my hand. In hotels, I rest soundly, eating prepackaged snacks, drinking small bottles of wine. All my life, I wanted to be close. Closeness, a dance the Hudson makes with the shore. I waitress at a seaside cafe, the kind where my manager applies more blush to my face and sharpens a red pencil for my smile. When I left home, wanting only nights where the night didn't end, to pass among bodies in the dark, to feel the love of sleepless hands. It's 4 a.m. on the Q train when a man shows me his dick. The cover of night is sleep. To be awake is to be seen. I ball my fists into my chest. Oh, my heart, my dove, who will love you forever as you are? The unfolding. I let a boy lick my paper skin because he told me I was pretty. I let a man undress me because he wouldn't stop kissing me. I left my body at a party, and then I left it again. A secret. Sadness has no sound. Not crying, just silence. Like how, at 5 a.m., I woke up in the back of a cab somewhere in Brooklyn, the driver watching me. I learned to love with no one watching. In my carpeted room, I was small, while outside tall trees blocked out a blinding sun. God moves in the laying on of hands. A child shivers in the church, her body wet with water. Then someone holds her, warms her, blesses her. I miss Raleigh in the winter, and I miss Ohio when it rains. In college, I would drive out past the fields, down the empty highways, 2 lanes flagged with fences, cows ambling, the sun setting, the sky growing pink. A secret. I let a man undress me because he wouldn't stop kissing me. And though I found him to be beautiful, my mind moved to the light shifting among trees, the fields unfolding. That poem, so my thesis at Warren Wilson was a book-length thesis, and this poem is one of the 2 from the thesis that's in my current book. Everything else I wrote after graduation. And when I graduated, I had the sense of like, oh, I think I'm finally figuring out how to write the poems I want to write, and now I have to teach myself how to write them. And so everything you're hearing tonight is like a result of that, and I feel like I've gotten a lot closer. And part of the project was just to write longer poems, because in grad school I realized I was primarily writing poems, and this poem I was writing poems around this length. And what I realized is that I was thinking, like, the length is a formal constraint, and my thinking was constrained, or there was a shape I was comfortable thinking in. And so a lot of the other poems that you've heard and will hear take up more space, and part of that was this desire to push myself past what I was comfortable with, literally, in terms of form. So, that being said, I'll read a really long poem. It's not that long. It's definitely longer, and this was a poem when I wrote it. I still don't know if I don't know if any poems are done, but this poem I think it's still teaching me a lot. Summer of nectar and green. I pluck a honeysuckle when I want something sweet. My mother cuts my hair and tells me not to leave the porch, which is why I am running through a stranger's backyard, and it is nearing dark when I tumble into a metal latch that holds the gate shut. Later, I hold napkins to my shoulder, watch each one burst, red. My skin will take days to purple and blue. Each day, I nurse my wound in the bathroom. Call it childhood, but under those lights, I was cleaning a gunshot crater from a saloon shootout, healing the deep slice of a dagger turned upon me as I battled that zombie through the night. It was only after she died that I learned my cousin's husband locked her in the bathroom for days at a time. I wonder what she bartered with against the God of her mind. Here's a sad story that I'm not supposed to tell. When my mother asked why this happened and how and what God could allow such suffering, I had to remind her of the time she read my diary. Months later, she confronted me about the fact that I had sex. She cried and told me everyone makes mistakes, and when I told her it wasn't a mistake, she cried like someone had died, and maybe I died, because in that diary that I wrote in for months, hiding out in my dormitory, I wrote down things I could never say, like when he entered me, I would beg to someone inside my mind for him to just speak to me again, or how, at lunch, to keep some peace, I would undress instead of eating, let him move his hands over me. But all this my mother did not notice when she read my diary, or maybe it was just my problem to bear. When I fantasize about the lives of other women, goodness is the thing I envy most. When I joined the gym, it was because I wanted to feel like them, but also because I wanted to outrun a bear if I had to. Not that I've ever seen a bear, but I heard one once in the mountains, its feet padding along the dirt and trail rot, its body bumping into a tree's thick bark. No. When I say I want to outrun a bear, it is because of all those times I was late coming back to the apartment where he was waiting, and I felt this electricity surge through me, almost as if I had seen a bear, or I knew one was there, but I was alone on the trail far from home, and though I searched, I had nowhere to turn, and what if this time he is not so kind? I'm gonna do something that is new for me to hear out loud, which is, so my manuscript right now is structured into 3 sections, although who knows, that could change. I'm still waiting on my editorial letter. And I'm definitely open to experimenting. But the middle section is a lyric essay. Nathan mentioned a poem where I write about my father's illness, and that singular poem came out of this larger project, which is in 2020, the end of 2020, going into 2021, my father had a psychotic break, and it was horrible. And part of the psychosis was that he was really paranoid about food. So my father's 5'11", but he went down to 106 pounds. And also because it was COVID and it was in North Carolina, there were no beds. in the psychiatric, there was a lot of extra barriers. When normally, I imagine pre-COVID, there were also just a lot of barriers to getting good help. And all that's to say, I learned a lot about poetry during that time, because what I'm going to read, the first draft of it, I wrote in the hospital, like just being with my dad, waiting to see my dad, running errands, sitting in the parking lots, taking breaks from being in the hospital. And I think that's, I don't know, but it like kept me sane, because the other thing I did during that time was I like desperately wanted to read a novel, and so I ended up reading Amy Bender's Butterfly Lampshade, which is amazing. And in that novel, the main character's mother is also having a mental health crisis. And yeah, so I guess all of that I think filters into this somehow, but this is like the first time I've read it out loud, so you guys will get to hear it, and so will I. Even in silence, I hear my father's voice calling out to me, my name a phantom, trembling the air. I have his jaw, his nose, the shape of my face, his name. Like my father, I carry a hole I cannot fill. I stuff it and stuff it. My father is perseverating, moving around the edges of rooms. On repeat, he asks, but how will we pay for it? How will we pay for it? He follows me, my mother, then my mother. Inside my childhood home, there are only so many rooms. On Christmas Day, I bake a loaf of frozen bread. I feed slices to my father with my hands, then catch each chewed up bit he pushes back out with his tongue. He is speaking. I am numb. At home, we keep my father from the news. The news addles his mind. In November, Russian hackers on the news. Then my father calls with news. Our accounts have been hacked, our computer. He tells me about the white car circling the cul-de-sac, where it parks, how it stays, evidence of plot or threat. Because my father refuses to eat, we try to feed him ice chips with a spoon. The chips melt and pool inside the pink plastic bowl we hold under his chin as he turns his face from side to side. Was I like this when I was a child? I lean over the table to help my father stand. My heart beats in the doldrums saying, I can. In the hospital, I tug the patterned curtains closed. A man laughs in the next bed over. I cannot see his face, but I imagine it full with round, soft cheeks. He had a kind of laugh like that, full of breath, sent up from a belly that must protrude. The nurse will keep the man until he sobers up. She reminds him not to drink so much. The man smiles and says, of course, and thank you, and please don't go. I sit beside my father and watch his IV drip. Each drop of saline hydrates his veins, his dry, cracked skin. My father weighs 107 pounds and is too weak to stand. I pop an earbud in his ear and keep one in mine. We listen to love songs. In the hallway, the doctor gives me a working diagnosis, major depressive disorder with psychotic features. He describes ECT treatments, the QT interval, how the brain will seize up, but that doctors know how to relax the body, that my father should feel no pain. Because the door to his room is cracked, my father calls my name. He wants to know what I am saying. I ask the psychiatrist if this will end and when. He smiles. Psychosis is cyclical. It crests like a wave. I think of a storm coming over my father's body, like how rain floods the neighborhood pool in the summer, all that displaced water. My father lifts his gown to show me his diaper. He asks, "How can I go to work like this?" He licks his cracked lips, the layers of skin peeling. He pushes the dead skin back with his tongue. When I'm not in the hospital, I read novels and eat apples and listen to music with words I do not know. I am zen, like a serial killer. Me, buttering toast, pouring coffee, ignoring the phone. Delight. If only a camera would pan over my morning routine, underscored by the warm sounds of bossa nova or mariachi, then cut suddenly to my father's severed head, sitting on a platter in the fridge. The vacant stare of death, and my cilantro wilting in an old jam jar. My knife would cut into the egg's translucent skin, spilling the yolk. Oh, I would wipe the plate clean with bread. Some mornings I consider all the men I've loved and lost. I do this often in the mornings, half awake in bed. Even in my sleepy state, I cover my eyes. When I relive my life, do I feel shame? Do I feel surprise? I understand loneliness as anything physical, promised then denied. Oh heart, a new day. My eyes open to an empty room. When my father was not perseverating, he drifted in and out of sleep. I would open my book to the hallway's light, but still I could not read. What is love without grief? Even my thoughts grew quiet inside the dark and windowless room. Sometimes I gave an excuse, feigning hunger. I had no hunger, I had no need. And I wandered the hospital halls. My fingers traced bubbles in the paint. When the mind is haunted, the mind is stalled. On the radio, Dan from Asheville is halfway through his great couch tour. Through his phone, he records songs he writes. People send him money to pay for his son's medical bills. Already two, and the bones of his son's small hands have fused. The father writes love songs. What else is there? My father always wanted me to become a doctor. In the hospital, beside my father, I close my eyes. I imagine myself in a white lab coat, a stethoscope thudding against my breast. Behind each closed door, I could listen to the fluttering heart beating inside each patient's chest. And then this is a separate new section. The final section, I think, but to be determined. A poem is a landscape of the mind. It was the winter of my life. Afternoons, I watched light fade from brownstones. I took long, aimless walks by the water. Each day, more leaves fell. The starkness of trees, their sheer nakedness. My friend called to tell me about a neighbor who cornered her in the stairwell. She described standing perfectly still. The shape of the lake nearing dusk, its symmetrical, man-made enclosures. Rumi speaks of sorrow as a clearing of leaves, making space for joy. But what to do with rage, and in such a desolate landscape? Walking to my car from the library, a stack of books piled high in front of me, I was stopped by a parked SUV filled with laughing men. They had parked in front of my, how did they know, car. They looked at me and laughed uproariously, and continued to laugh as the man in the driver's seat got out. I don't remember what I said, but I used the word, please. Consider the accrual of knowledge. There are facts, like the mechanics of throwing a punch, how the abdominals contract, twisting the torso, powering the shoulder, arm extending, knuckles bursting skin, such force, a fire from within. My friend says, you go through life thinking you're a person, then learning just how many people see you as an object, a thing that placates or slakes. I quiet my mind with the sight of the lake. Trauma is not the event itself, but the body's learned response. When identifying domestic violence, professionals look for signs like a fist through a wall, a chair with 3 legs instead of 4, the message being, next time, this could be you, the you being me, when I circled 37 out of 50 red flags on the Stop Domestic Violence pamphlet, when I dialed the 1-800 number. In therapy, I study my enclosures, the small dark spaces of my mind. I practice telling myself, you are not your thoughts, but the watcher of your thoughts, the watcher watching over you. But then there is the relationship to one's own authority. You have to decide you'll win, says a man in the boxing ring, wrapping his hands. Each time I spar, I choke. And, okay. There are two poems I want to read that are also still figuring themselves out. They're very new, but I put them in the manuscript. This one is called Cityscapes. I went to see a psychic about my broken heart. She told me I pick men who are wounded just like me, but show pain differently, their rage turned out instead of in. When I played with Barbies, I often set them into space, or some other dark, remote place resembling my mind. Their open-faced dollhouse made me cry, each time I made the dolls fall off the roof, their hard bodies clattering back into this life. Yes, I suffer from romantic thoughts. Sometimes I think suffering is the measure of my devotion, sometimes not. It takes so much to feel safe in the world. Or is that just me? I struggle with intimacy. On the subway, I look to strangers and wonder if one of them could want me. Then the sudden screech of metal upon metal returns me to my Google Doc, where I write down my thoughts. Consider the undulating rhythm of the city, each stop and start and sudden halt. Consider the way light breaks across the East River at dusk, where love does not so much come to me as move through me. And I'm still trying to, this last poem I'll read, I'm trying to figure out if it's the last poem or almost the last poem, but for today it'll be the last poem. Harvest. All summer, I prayed for clarity of sight, light falling through the leaves, a flock of starlings before rain. Of the psychic who counseled repeatedly that I must become familiar with love, so as to see its opposite when it rushed toward me. Those fragments, its song, linger, rising up now and again. I am to let pain drain from me like earth after rain. Oh, obsession, that closed fist. Though here again is mist rising off the water just after dawn. Now autumn comes early, August leaves brown in the heat. Detritus from the maple covers the street where a pearled wasp's nest glistens in dew, while wasps drift hazily in and out. Like those figures which cloud the edge of memory, dissolving each time in a kind of rain. How should love feel when we receive it? I think of those late summer walks through the meadow and the neighboring meadow, where I was not longing, but the one who was longed for. Thank you.